Welcome everybody, this is Jacob Sieg with Certified Photo Training. We are going to be talking about the exposure triangle over the next couple of days. Now I know everybody struggles with the exposure triangle when you're first starting out as a photographer, so what I'm going to do for everybody today is try to make it as easy as possible for you. We are going to start out by first talking about ISO and how it relates to actually making a photograph itself. And then we're going to talk about all the different stops. And now that means when I say stops, I'm talking about all the different numbers that are on the back of your camera. I'm going to try to clear that up for everybody. So with that said, the first thing to understand about ISO is that your ISO is what makes up your image. So it is actually what creates your photograph. So you have to imagine that from the film era, we had negatives, and our negatives was what our ISO was. In digital terms, we now have a digital sensor, and that is what your megapixels are, or your megapixels is what makes up your photograph that's on the back of your camera. A good way to think about that is if you were to just hit play on your camera and whatever image came up, your image sensor ISO is in the back of your camera at all times. Okay, so that's extremely important to understand because your image sensor is your image quality. So when you go out into the field, you need to be thinking about image sensor quality at all times. So whether you go out on a day like today, on a direct sunlight day like today, or an overcast day, or you're shooting at night, you should be thinking in your head ISO. Now, backing that up to the film era, you would actually get rolls of film that were a certain ISO, or they called it ASA, and that was your speed of film. So you would actually load whatever speed of film you wanted into your camera given the situation that you were in. So your image sensor is what actually makes up your photograph, and that's really important. Now I know a lot of people trip up on ISO, and I'm going to simplify it for everybody, okay? So ISO makes up your image, so that should tell you that, well, let me back that one up. The lower your ISO, the finer your details are going to be, and the richer your color is going to be. So when you're at a low ISO, you actually are at a very fine grain or a very fine noise, okay? In the film era, it was grain, okay? But in the digital era, it's noise. So I want you to think of it this way. Think about like an analog television. Think about that white noise that you get when it didn't have a signal. Well, that white noise is actually trying to pick up a signal from the radio waves. It's not any different with photography. It's the exact same thing. Your image sensor is in the back of your camera in pure darkness. It's sensitive to light, and it's awaiting light to hit it. And guess what's blocking your image sensor from getting hit by light is your shutter speed curtain, which we'll be talking about tomorrow or the next day, but we're going to just talk about ISO today and why it's so important. So, like I was saying, ISO makes up your image. That's why it's so important. When you go out into the field, you need to be thinking, what ISO should I start with? That's what I do. When I go into the field, I'm instantly thinking, you need to be at the lowest ISO that you can go. Okay, so you should be thinking your goal is 100, 200 ISO, whatever is the lowest ISO that you can get to, given that you can still balance out your exposure triangle, okay? We're going to be talking more about the exposure triangle over the next couple of days, but I just wanted to talk about ISO today. Now, a good way to think about what ISO stands for is image sensitivity, but it actually doesn't stand for that at all. It actually stands for International Standards Organization, that sets the standards for measurements on film. Now, that's just photography film. There's all kinds of different kinds of film out there. There's X-ray film, infrared film, heat vision, night vision, all that kind of stuff. That's all set by ISO, okay? So, with that said, you can get extremely high ISOs, like the Hubble telescope uses extremely high ISOs, and that's so it can pick up distant light off in the distance. So think of it this way. ISO is what picks up the amount of light that you're letting into your camera. Okay, so your ISO makes up your image. Okay, so with that being said, you need to know that your goal is the low ISO. Okay, now I say 100, but some cameras will go down to like 50 ISO, or even lower than that. And I just say your goal is 100 ISO because most cameras have that, okay? Now, with that being said, you don't want to be afraid to raise your ISO if you absolutely need to, okay? If you're shooting in low light, if you're in a situation where, you know, it's 7 p.m. and it's kind of dusk out and you're struggling to get a fast enough shutter speed and you're getting, you know, motion shake from your camera, or your own movements or breathing or something like that, you're going to get motion shake. So sometimes you do need to raise your ISO from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800, even 1600 in order to get a proper exposure so that you don't get a blurry image, okay? So if you're forcing yourself into a situation where you're at 100 ISO all the time, you may find yourself at such a slow shutter speed. And I know a lot of you guys in the group, I've been seeing some of your portraits come through that are at the lower end of the scale of shutter speed. And I see you're at 100 ISO, but you should be swapping that out. So the exposure triangle is a push-pull type situation. So with that being said, when you're looking at my screen here, if you look along the bottom, you'll notice that it goes from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 to 1600, 3200, 6400, and then 12800. Okay, so every time that number doubles, you double the sensitivity to light, okay? We call those stops of light. So when you go from 100 to 200, you're actually getting twice as sensitive to light. So we call that one stop, all right? Now when you go from 200 to 400, you're getting 2 times, okay? So that's 2 stops. Every time you jump from 100, every time you double your ISO, you're actually getting +1 stop of light or -1 stop of light, depending which way you're going. Now look above ISO and where all those little bikes are with the numbers. See where it says brighter with the arrow going to the right? Every time you raise your ISO, you're giving your camera more sensitivity to light. You're giving your camera more ability to pick up light. But every time you raise that ISO 1 stop, you're actually adding noise. Remember where I talked about how you're adding like white noise on a television? You're adding noise to your image sensitivity so it is more able to pick up light. The noisier your image, the more sensitive it is to light. That's why they call it noise. Like I said, it's picking up light just like a tube TV would be picking up an analog radio signal. Same idea. You need that static to pick up a photon, essentially. But I don't want to go down that path too far. So when you go from 100 to 200, you're +1 brighter. Okay, so let's say you're out in the field and your images are coming out a little dark and you're at 100 ISO. Well, if you just went from 100 to 200 and then 200 to 400, that's 200% more light, and that will brighten up your image. You're going to get a little bit more noise, but that's okay. Okay, sometimes you don't want to miss a moment. Like for instance, if you're photographing a wedding and you're in a situation where like there's no light at all, right? It's practically dark, and you can't use too slow of a shutter because people are in motion, you can't get a blurry image. And say the bride is crying, or someone's giving a toast and the bride's starting to cry, and there's like no light in those reception areas. It happens all the time. You raise your ISO to the highest possible, whatever you need it to be in order to capture that moment, because missing that moment, if you miss a shot because you're too afraid to raise your ISO, and it's one of those moments that later your client is like, hey, where's that one image of me crying when my dad was giving that speech, and you have to tell them that you missed it? Trust me, you don't want to be in that situation. I've been in that situation before, and you don't want to be there. That bride or whoever it is that hired you is making sure that you capture that moment. So don't be afraid to raise your ISO. I tell people that all the time. Your goal is a low ISO because it has the highest image quality, has the richest color, but don't be afraid to raise it as long as you're still balancing out your exposure meter, which we'll talk about more. But again, I just wanted to kind of clear up ISO for everybody, kind of get their heads wrapped around it. Now, if you look at the diagram that I have here on screen, you'll notice that at 100, there's no like pixelation or noise at all. And as you advance over to the right-hand side, up past 6400, you'll notice that there's a lot more breakup of the image. Now, this breakup of the images, like I said, is from the noise, but you can actually get some really unique effects if you intentionally shoot at a high ISO and maybe go black and white or something like that. It'll give you that old film feel, as long as you hit your exposure value accurately. Now, there's noise, and then there's colored noise, okay? So colored noise distortion is when you miss your exposure value so much that the camera is trying to make up what it thinks should be in that area, if that makes sense at all. So image sensor, like I said, is in the back of your camera at all times, waiting for light to pick it up. So if you want to think about it this way, you take your lens off, this is your aperture. If you look inside, underneath your mirror is your shutter curtain, and when you open and close your camera, it's actually going to reveal your image sensor. Okay, so if you can see that, it's actually here. We'll do this. What I want everybody to look at here is this little bluish hue that's in the back of my lens. That's the image sensor right there. I'll do it again. That blue area, that's your image sensor. That's what creates your image, and that's why it's protected from light at all times, okay? It's protected from light at all times because it's sensitive to light. Any light that hits it's going to expose it and create a photograph if it's focused by a lens, okay? It needs to be focused by a lens, otherwise it's just going to turn out like my image did there. This is an exposed sensor that doesn't have a focus beam of light hitting it, so there's no photograph. It's just an exposed sensor without any focus to it. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes some sense. So with that said, you should always be thinking about your ISO. When you go into the field, you should always be thinking about your ISO, and you should be looking for split lighting conditions. On a direct sunlight day like today, I'm looking at the street out here, and part of the street is in highlight, and part of the street is in shade from the tree. That's two different exposure values. That's almost 300% apart. So if I'm photographing a bird that's in the direct sunlight, I might be at 100 ISO. If that bird moves over to the shade 3 feet or a meter, then I'm going to be at 400 ISO or something like that. Okay, so you have to be looking at light in terms of what ISO you're going to be at. So don't be afraid to change your ISO around, but you have to be able to interpret light differently. Okay, you have to be able to interpret the light that your subject is in. When you've heard me talk about YSL before, use subject light source, you have to ask yourself, what type of light is your subject in? Not what type of light you're in. That doesn't matter, because it's where your lens is falling and where it's falling onto. So you have to be paying attention to where your subject is. And we're talking about just ISO right now, and I so badly want to start comparing ISO to shutter speed and aperture, but I know that you have to learn them independently. So I want to recap kind of what we just talked about before I go any further. 100 to 200 is one stop brighter. 200 to 400 is one stop brighter. 400 to 800 is one stop brighter. 800 to 1600 is one stop brighter. Okay, 400 to 1600 is two stops brighter. Okay, going the other way, 1600 to 400 is two stops darker, because when you go lower on the ISO scale, when you get to a lower number, you're actually getting less sensitive to light. The more sensitive to light that you are, the more noise that there is, the more able that you're able to collect light or gather light, or the more light gathering capability that it has. Okay, that will apply to aperture too, but we'll get there. Okay. What I want to talk about next is the difference between a full frame camera and a crop sensor camera, because I know there's a lot of confusion about that. I'm going to try to clear that up for everybody. This is what a full frame camera's sensor is. Okay, so one of these squares on this negative, this is the size of a full frame sensor. Okay, is a 35 millimeter negative. So when they first made digital cameras, they actually made the sensors quite a bit smaller than this. And even the cameras that are on your phones are even smaller than that. Okay, so since they're so small, now remember, everything in photography is counterintuitive. Okay, so you would think, oh, if it's smaller, because you've heard of the crop factor, right? A lot of you've heard of the crop factor. So you have a digital camera, you put a 50 millimeter lens on your digital camera. It is now a 75 millimeter lens, because you actually are changing the ratio in which light is projecting onto your image sensor because your image sensor is smaller than the lens was designed for. So a full frame camera, I have problems with that because people that start with crop sensors, they don't know the difference in focal lengths. See what I'm saying? So like, if you started with a digital camera, you never used a 35 millimeter or full frame camera before, you don't know the difference. So just know that it's the ratio in which light gets projected out from the back area of your lens. So the end cap of your lens, that actual piece of glass, and the distance from that, where it's getting the focus light is coming through it, the distance from there and the edges of your sensor or negative, that is your crop factor. So if you're putting a 50 millimeter lens onto a digital body, you're going to get a times 1.5 or a times 1.6, depending on what camera brand you're using. So a good way I like to just say 1.5, even though it kind of varies from camera to camera, and like by 0.1. And I like, honestly, for me, I like that, okay, because I like to use long focal length. So, I do miss using full frame cameras, but I also like using crop sensors. Now remember, crop sensors are smaller than a full frame camera, and that's why you get a magnification, okay? When you get a bigger sensor, you actually don't get it doesn't magnify, okay? So it, again, is counterintuitive. The smaller your image sensor, the more it's going to magnify in order to project onto that image sensor. And that's just optics, okay? But I don't know how I got there when I'm talking about ISO. Let's see. So I kind of explained the stops of light there. Obviously, there's more to it. You probably recognize the different stops there on ISO. Okay, so between 100 and 200, there's going to be 1/3 stop increments. Okay, between 200 and 400, there's 1/3 stop increments. So remember when I say when you go from 200 to 400, you're doubling your number, giving you plus 1 stop of light. It's super easy. It's units of light. It's all it is. It's units of light, and each unit is 100% of light. So when you go and take a 1/3 stop, it's 33%. Okay, 2/3 of the stop is 66. Okay, so it's just like building blocks. You just make building like building a house. Okay, so what is your exposure value? You figure that out by looking at your exposure meter, and then you're able to, using the exposure triangle, you're able to translate that any way that you want for your desired result. Okay, so using a tripod, like I said, your goal is always going to be a low ISO. You want to be at a low ISO as often as possible, but don't be afraid to raise it. With a tripod, with a monopod, it allows you to be at a lower ISO, without getting camera shake if you can communicate well with your portrait subjects, okay? When you're applying ISO to portraits, you have to be thinking about whether or not they're in motion. And with a lot of my posing style, I do a lot of in-motion posing, so I shoot at faster shutter speeds. Now I'm bleeding over into shutter speed a little bit. I shoot at faster shutter speeds that requires me to be at a higher ISO in order to get that fast of a shutter speed. We'll talk more about that in the next couple of days. I heard somebody in the group recently talk about how ISO is tripping them up, which made me think about doing this lesson for everybody, because every time you double your ISO, you're just increasing your exposure. It's like if you go from 100 to 200, you're brightening your image. If you go from 200 to 100, you're darkening your image. It's as simple as that. If you go to the right of the scale, you're getting a brighter image. If you go to the left of the scale, you're getting a darker image. It's about that balance, okay? So you don't want to get too high of an ISO, but you also don't want too slow of a shutter speed, and you don't want too wide of an aperture for your desired result, or whatever the case may be. So you learn the rules, then you apply the rules, and then you figure out which rules apply to your style of photography, if that makes any sense, okay? And that's why they call it the art of photography. You got to learn the rules, then you break them, and then you develop your own style, and that's when you start to really make some money. So that was, did I cover everything I wanted to do? Oh, I wanted to leave you with some, quote-unquote best settings or what to expect when you're out in the field. If you're shooting in direct sunlight, you should probably be at 100 or 200 ISO, okay? Pretty much a given. But you got to pay attention to whether or not you're photographing into the shadow side of somebody, okay? Because Highlight to shadow is like a 300% difference. That's almost a 3-stop difference. So if you're photographing something that's being hit by direct sunlight on one side, you'll probably want to be at 100 ISO. But if you're photographing the opposite side of that person or the opposite side of that building that's in shade, you may want to be at 400 ISO, okay? It depends which side of your subject is being lit by what type of light, okay? So if your subject is being lit by direct sunlight, pretty much a dead giveaway you're going to be at 100 ISO. Because it's so bright, you don't need a lot of image sensitivity to pick up that light. I know I'm going on a long tangent here, and hopefully you guys are following along. I think it helps to just keep repeating yourself and repeating yourself and repeating yourself, because I feel like that starts to really stick in there. And then, overcast days, that should tell you should be about a 400 ISO. And if you got a tripod, you should most likely be at 100 ISO. If you're in really low light, don't be afraid to be at 1600 or even 3200 ISO. And then I think with that, everybody, I think that's going to wrap up our ISO section of our exposure triangle. I do want everybody to go ahead, if you're interested in more portrait tips, learning more about photography, go ahead and go to this website, certifiedphototraining.com/register. I actually have a 45-minute free training that I've developed over the last 6 months right here, and I want everybody in the group to make sure you go out and you check that out, and then make sure you wait for tomorrow too. At the same time, we're going to be doing aperture tomorrow. Then we're going to be doing shutter speed on Monday, and then we're going to combine them all on Tuesday, I think, if we can. We'll see how these go out. We've been practicing this new software we have, and it's cold out, and we're all stuck inside. So anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We'll check you later. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you later. Thanks.